morning, everyone, and welcome to the JKMRC Friday Morning Seminar Series. On behalf of the University of Queensland and Sustainable Minerals Institute, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and the descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections with country, and we recognize their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. And for today's seminar, it is my pleasure to welcome Teresa Ubide. Teresa is an Associate Professor in Igneous Petrology, Volcanology at the University of Queensland. She is an ARC Future Fellow and won the 2023 Anton Hales Medal, Australian Academy of Science. She combines novel LA-ICP-MS approaches with detailed microscope observations to interrogate magmatic crystals and their carriers melts at elemental and isotope levels. Her research constrains magma transport and storage through the Earth's upper mantle and crust, with a particular focus on the drivers of volcanic eruptions and the processes that lead to the accumulation of metals that are critical for the energy transition. Today, Teresa will give us a talk titled A Microanalytical Approach to Magmas, Volcanic Eruption, and Energy Critical Metals. Let's give a warm welcome to Teresa.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for the introduction, for the invitation to be here. Thanks, everyone, for joining me here and also online. I'm very excited to talk to you about how we can use microanalysis to discover secrets hidden in our magmatic crystals. And this is going to give us clues on why magmatic systems may change from a state of dormancy to a state of eruption, or maybe accumulate metals that we need for our energy transition. This is work that I'm doing with my team at UQ and also collaborators in Australia and internationally, and all of these people make the work really interesting and fun. So I would like to first of all thank everyone for making this so much fun. So this image here is an elemental map of zirconium obtained by laser ablation mass spectrometry, LA-ICP-MS, from a megacrust of pyroxene from the island of Stromboli in Italy, which is a really active volcano. And so you can see that this is a pretty large crystal. The scale is on the bottom right corner. It's, at least for geological standards, it's a megacrust. And it's beautifully zoned. You can see as the crystal grew, it changed in composition from core to rim, but also it has different compositions if you look at it in different crystallographic orientations. So the composition along the z-axis in the vertical plane here is different to the composition horizontally perpendicular to the z-axis. And that has implications for the way the crystal has grown, and that therefore has implications that we can, in terms of interpreting magmatic histories. You can also see this crystal has lots of inclusions. There are bits of yellow and blue that are all the minerals that this big megacrust trapped as it grew in the magmatic environment. So all of this information is available to us thanks to imaging this crystal with LA-ICP-MS. It's really powerful, and it's really important because we really want to understand better magmatic systems. We know magmatic systems can Thank you. Thank you very much. We know magmas can lead to eruption, sometimes catastrophic eruption, like the 1991 eruption at Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, which decreased global temperatures by 0.5 degrees for the following 2 years. Or the more recent Tonga eruption in 2022, which was captured by satellites and caused tsunami events. So volcanoes can cause major natural hazards. They can impact air traffic. They can impact the climate. And also magmatic systems are interesting because they can accumulate metals that we need for our energy transition, like copper or rare earth elements that we need to cope with the change in climate we're experiencing, as we can see in this summary of the increase of temperature from the 19th century up until only recently, where the red colors represent increasing temperatures. Very scary. So the more we study volcanoes, the more we realize how complex they are inside, and how the volcano we see at the surface is just the tip of the iceberg. We no longer think volcanoes are fed by balloon-style magma chambers. We now know from petrology, geochemistry, and geophysical evidence that they are fed by very complex, multi-level plumbing system that can span the entire crust and into the lithosphere. And they are dominated by crystals. And actually, eruptible pockets can be quite ephemeral. And so in this new paradigm for magmatic plumbing systems, we really want to understand what are the tipping mechanisms that make the system change. So why do these systems suddenly erupt? Or why do these systems, in some cases, accumulate metals that we need for the energy transition, and in many other cases, they don't? What are those tipping mechanisms? Why, where, and when does the system tip to a change? And you can imagine in this new paradigm of plumbing systems, where the system is dominated by crystals, the crystals might hold some information for us to extract, and the challenge is to get that information out from the crystals. That's our adventure, and that's where microanalysis is going to be very helpful. One of the key mechanisms that drive these systems to erupt is the arrival of new magma into the system. More mafic, primitive, anti-gas magma can generate instabilities in the system and overpressure and make the system erupt. And so in volcanology, we are very interested in tracking such magma recharge and mixing events into the system. And what we get at the surface in the volcanic part of the system at the very top are volcanic rocks like these ones. So this is an example of a thin section of a trachy basalt from Mount Etna, one of the most active volcanoes on Earth in Italy. And it has crystals, large crystals, phenocrysts of clinopyroxene, that's the CPX, plagioclase, that's the PL, and olivine, that's the OL, in a finer grained matrix. Now, these crystals have been incorporated into the ascending magma on the way to the surface, and we don't know where in these complex mass systems the individual crystals come from. You can imagine they have been picked up from different parts of the system, and so it's going to be interesting to unravel what is the story that these crystals are holding. So we can analyze those crystals, we can investigate them under the microscope, we can do electron microprobe analysis for major elements, we can do spot analysis for trace elements. But what's very useful is to do elemental imaging of those crystals. And if we do LA-ICP-MS, we can get trace element concentrations. So let's have a look at examples of these crystals imaged with laser ablation ICP-MS. And that's what we get. So these have different key elements that we investigate in these different minerals. And you can see that all of them, the plagioclase, the pyroxene, and the olivine, have very distinct rims. So that's interesting because those rims are formed just before the eruption. And those rims are high in chromium for the pyroxene, high in nickel for the olivine, and low in barium to strontium ratio for the plagioclase. And all of those rims agree with the arrival of new magma into the system that is more primitive and that has driven eruption. So that's really interesting. This means we can track if a particular volcanic system has been triggered by this type of new magma coming into the system or not. But it's also interesting to realize that the inner part of the crystals, the cores, are quite different in the olivine, plagioclase, and pyroxene examples. You can see the pyroxene is the most complex by far. And that's because pyroxene is stable across a broad range of pressures and temperatures and water contents. And not only that, it is able to record a lot of processes and preserve them. Because when we have chemical heterogeneities in our crystals, and the crystals are stored in hot temperatures, those heterogeneities tend to diffuse and blur. And that's what happens very often in the olivine. Many elements in olivine diffuse fast, and so they can easily get lost to diffusion upon storage at high temperature. Whereas the pyroxene, and particularly chromium in pyroxene, holds to its record. Not only it records processes, it also preserves them. In the case of the plagioclase on the bottom left corner, it does have slow diffusion, so it should be able to preserve processes really well. It does. But plagioclase is often more stable when we degas our magmas at shallow depths. So the processes the plagioclase sees are different to the ones that pyroxene sees. So we are picking pyroxene from deeper in the system and then plagioclase from shallower in the system. And that's all very interesting because we can put all the information together to get to know what happens in the volcano before it erupts. And these chemical maps not only allow us to do that, but they also make us discover things we were not even thinking about. So these are maps of that mega crust of pyroxene we saw at the very beginning on the title slide. So you can see this mega crust is beautifully zoned, lots of chemical variations. If we look at the top row, lithium, nickel, chromium, all of those elements seem to be controlled by concentric oscillations from core to rim. But lithium is much more blurred than nickel, than chromium, and that's the effect of diffusion. Lithium diffuses faster and it tends to blur all the chemical heterogeneities. Nickel a bit slower, chromium very slow. So there you go. In chromium, you have very sharp zonations preserved. Fantastic. Now, if we look at the rare earth elements in the second row or the high field strength elements in the bottom row, they seem to have a different zonation pattern. They do record oscillations, but the majority of the changes reflect changes in crystallography. The sectors that grow along the z-axis in vertical have a different composition than the sectors that grow perpendicular to the z-axis in the horizontal plane on that slide. And so that's very interesting because different elements are behaving differently. And that's a bit confusing, but it's also very interesting because it seems that we can still use the top row elements, like, for example, chromium, to still see those changes in magma chemistry in the system because they are recorded very well. And we can use the rare earth elements and the high field strength elements to get to know why do we have this sector zoning in this crystal and not in others. And it's a very interesting observation because when we have sector zoning in our pyroxenes, that suggests that the pyroxene has grown in a more dynamic, in more dynamic conditions. And so in a very simplistic sketch, this means that we have, for example, growth upon convection or growth upon ascent or growth upon degassing. Something's happening that is perturbing the system and is generating that sector zoning. And we still keep elements like chromium holding on the oscillatory variations. And that's going to be really interesting because dynamic systems of crystallization are often very interesting in terms of triggering eruptions or in terms of generating mineralization. So let's look into that. Can we use these elemental images that we have developed with a more volcanology focus to try to understand magmatic or hydrothermal deposits? And I'm going to first talk about rare earth element concentrations in magmatic systems, in alkaline systems first and then peralkaline systems. So can we use these pyroxene records to better understand the accumulation of rare earth elements in our magmas? So I've been talking about sector zoning and how it develops when we start to grow our crystals a little bit in a more dynamic system, a little bit faster. And this is controlled by the degree of magma undercooling. So the degree of magma undercooling is the difference, delta T, on the right-hand side, between the liquidus temperature of the magma, above which there are no crystals, and below which we start to crystallize, and the temperature of crystallization, the temperature of the system. Now, you can imagine we can increase the degree of undercooling if we cool down the system and the temperature drops, or if we manage to increase the liquidus temperature, and we can do that, for example, via degassing. If we lose volatiles If we lose water, we will increase the liquidus temperature. So these processes will manage to increase the degree of undercooling, and therefore our crystals grow faster. And if our crystals grow faster, we change from euhedral crystals to sector-zone to skeletal, dendritic, and eventually, if they grow really fast, for example, during magma ascent, we generate lots of small microlights. So because this is controlled by the degree of undercooling, this means that we can reproduce it in a laboratory setting doing experimental petrology, where we subject magmatic compositions to known pressure and temperature conditions. And what we're going to do is try to specifically investigate what happens with the rare earths in this process. So these are experiments undertaken in collaboration with INGB and Sapienza University of Rome in Italy, and analyzed, mapped for trace elements by my former PhD student, now Dr. Alice MacDonald. And so you can see as we increase the degree of undercooling from the left, 25 degrees, to the right, 173 degrees, the shape of the pyroxenes changes from large and euhedral to skeletal to dendritic and small. And also the zonation styles change from sector-zoned to skeletal as we moved from left to right. Not only that, these maps are not only pretty images, they're full of data we can extract. This is quantitative data that we can extract and interrogate further. And so Alice went on and extracted rare earth element data from all of these images. And what she found out is that when we look at the rare earth element distribution or partitioning between the clinopyroxene and the melt, things changed with the degree of magma undercooling. So these are plots where you have the rare earth element partitioning between the pyroxene and the liquid represented against ionic radii. And so the rare earth elements plot from lanthanum to lutetium from right to left in each diagram. Now, you can see that as we increase the degree of undercooling in each of these diagrams, the rare earth element partitioning goes up. And what's very interesting is that if we crystallize pyroxene at high degrees of undercooling rapidly, we incorporate more heavy rare earth elements in the pyroxene than we leave behind in the melt. The rare earth elements become compatible as the degree of undercooling increases and it goes really high. And that's interesting because if you imagine a magma is forming pyroxene, the pyroxene should not be taking too many rare earth elements at low degrees of undercooling. But if you form pyroxene at high degrees of undercooling, the pyroxene is going to steal all the rare earth elements from the magma, and you will have a magma that has no rare earth elements left. Not good news if you are looking for rare earth elements. So we modeled what would happen from a starting composition on the left if we grow pyroxene crystals at different degrees of undercooling, and what happens to that residual melt as we fractionate pyroxenes out of it. And so we're moving from left to right on those diagrams, from low lanthanum to high lanthanum. And you can see how if we are at low degrees of undercooling, which is the pink or the maroon models, the ytterbium concentration in the melt increases. But if we crystallize pyroxene at high degrees of undercooling, the ytterbium in the melt decreases. So this is modeling exactly what I said, how we are stealing rare earth elements, heavy rare earth elements from the melt, and the melt is becoming depleted in them. As I said, not good if we are after concentrating rare earth elements to high levels. And not only that, we can parameterize the relationship between the rare earth element partitioning and the degree of undercooling and use that to apply it to natural crystals and track how the degree of undercooling increases from the levels of storage to initial ascent to eruption and emplacement. And so you can see how we can quantitatively track the story of ascent of that magma via the rare earth element concentrations. And remember, all of this is in crystals that are sector zone, that are telling us about these dynamic crystallization conditions. Now, I have another example for you of using pyroxenes to understand rare earth element mineralization in alkaline magmas, in peralkaline magmas. And this is a case study in the Tungai deposit in New South Wales, which is a peralkaline rare earth element deposit. It's a trachyte sill that is enriched in rare earth elements and heavy rare earth elements, and is being investigated by my PhD student, Brennan Simpson, who works for the Geological Survey in New South Wales. So he not only went to the field and collected samples from Tungai and drill cores, he also went to the field and collected samples of all the nearby intrusions that seemed to be related to Tungai, but were not mineralized. And then collected the samples and looked at the petrography and realized that, interestingly, many of the pyroxenes were very fresh, as opposed to the majority of the rock, which was not. So that was quite interesting, because he said, well, if the pyroxenes are happy, we can investigate the pyroxenes in the non-mineralized and the mineralized intrusions and then see what the differences are. So one thing that he observed already petrographically is that the pyroxenes were changing in composition as we approached mineralization. So he was moving from diopside cores on the top right corner with edgerine rims to pure edgerine crystals, as you can see in the panel E there, very pretty green edgerine crystals. And in the mineralization, he could also observe, as had been described previously, crystals of eudalite, like you see in panel H, which hold all those rare earth elements and high field strength elements in the mineralized area. Now, he then analyzed those pyroxenes initially with major elements, and he saw a beautiful trend in which, as we differentiate the magma and make it more and more alkaline, peralkaline, as we move into the closer and closer to the Tungai deposit, the pyroxenes generate this trend that follows initially the blue pattern of decreasing magnesium, increasing iron, and then increasing sodium. And then when you hit Tungai, which is the mineralized trachyte, you have a lot of sodium, as you would expect from an peralkaline edgerine. Now, not only he saw this beautiful trend and how the magma is becoming more and more peralkaline, he also mapped the pyroxenes for trace elements. And what he found is that as he moved into the mineralized area, the Tungai trachyte, he found that the pyroxenes were sector zoned. Only in the mineralized area, the pyroxenes are sector zoned. And only in the mineralized area, the pyroxenes do not hold rare earth elements and high field strand earth elements, because those go into the eudalite, which doesn't occur elsewhere. So that's really interesting, because it tells you that you can apparently track that, that's enrichment process through the pyroxene chemistry, and something special is happening in the mineralized area that is generating eudalites, but also the sector zone pyroxenes that hold no rare earth elements of high field strength elements. Interestingly, the mineralized trachyte is very strongly vesiculated, as you can see in his sketch on the bottom right corner. And so if this magma, during its emplacement, it has degassed, you would expect the magma and the cooling has increased, and therefore that would have led to potentially crystallization with sector zoned textures. But also, they may also have led to the formation of the eudalites holding all the rare earth element budget in the magma. And importantly, that means that to be able to reach this level of enrichment, you have to have held the volatiles in the magma for long enough so that the rare earth elements have been remained dissolved in the magma until emplacement, and then they have generated the mineralization. So this is all work in process, really exciting, because it suggests that perhaps we can use pyroxene textures and chemistries to track a vector for mineralization elsewhere, which would be really exciting. And I'm talking lots about sector zoning, but there is a super mineral that all geologists know about that is often sector zoned, and that is zircon. And that's actually really interesting, because not only zircon is sector zoned, and when it is sector zoned, again, it suggests that you have had some sort of certain dynamic conditions that have led to that sector zoning. And interestingly, this is work led by John Caulfield from Queensland University of Technology. Many of those zircons that are sector zoned hold very different compositions between the sectors, which can be difficult, particularly if you're looking at a zircon standard. This is TOMORA 2, analyzed with split stream laser ablation mass spectrometry, where you have one laser producing an aerosol that then becomes split into 2 mass spectrometers. So you get high precision geochronology and trace element data. And so you can see that some elements have 2 peaks because of the sectors, others don't, which is important to take into consideration when you are doing zircon analysis. But also it's important because many porphyry copper deposits have zircon that has sector zoning, which is interesting because then barren, related barren areas don't have this sector zoning. So again, this seems to suggest you have some dynamic conditions that may lead to, you know, ticking all the key ingredients to reach mineralization. Really interesting. So all we've been talking about has been at an elemental level. So we've been trying to track different batches of magma coming in into our magmatic systems. And we've also been trying to track how those crystals have formed and what type of dynamic conditions have led to their growth and textures. But if we want to understand what is the origin of these different batches of melt, we really want to understand what are the sources of those magmas in the mantle and what type of potential crustal contamination they have gone through. And that has implications, again, for the development of eruptions and for mineralization. And from now on, I'm going to specifically talk about copper, which is accumulated mainly in porphyry copper deposits in magmatic arcs. So in magmatic arcs, you have magma generation from the mantle wedge, which is metasomatized by slab fluids. And then those magmas have a long way to go until they reach the surface or the hydrothermal system in porphyry copper deposits. So you can imagine the level of complexity in these MASH systems is extremely high, because in an arc setting, particularly in a continental arc, you have a lot of stuff to go through. It's a very complicated journey. And so trying to decipher this type of journey is really complicated. And we really want to understand, you know, that if we have what type of magma generation we have, what type of deep fractionation, what type of journey up to the surface, and what happens in the magmatic hydrothermal region, to see what are the key mechanisms that drive mineralization. And so what we want to do is try to see if the crystals, again, can hold some of that information for us. So this is an image from the Australian synchrotron of calcium distribution in an andesite from Merapi, where you can see we have crystals of pyroxenes, plagioclases, and in a fine-grained matrix that is purple in color. And all of these crystals are going to hold records for us to explore. So one of the key things we want to do, if we want to get deeper into the sources and contamination process through those complex plumbing systems, is look at strontium isotope ratios. Because isotopic ratios are going to give us information on the source and contamination processes, and because isotope ratios of strontium can be measured very precisely in plagioclase, which is a very abundant mineral in arc magmas. The most abundant mineral in arc magmas. Now, you can do very precise analysis if you take the bulk rock or bulk crystals or even micro-drilled materials from the crystals, and then you do column chemistry on that, and then you analyze it, for example, via TIMS. You can get down to the 6th decimal place in precision. Fantastic, but that takes a lot of work. And it doesn't often tell you what happens at the individual zone level. Because even if you micro drill, which takes a lot of effort, you won't be able to get to very small zones, and you won't be able to get to too many because it's a lot of work. So what we wanted to do is try to investigate this kind of strontium isotope chemical zonation at a higher resolution and more rapidly. And that we do with the laser again, but coupling the laser to a multi-collector mass spectrometry. So this is a picture of the lab at UQ, the RIF lab. And that's one of our lasers at the back in white. the quadruple mass spectrometer is to the right of it. And at the front here, you have the multi-collector mass spectrometer, which is a much bigger instrument, which is able to give us isotopic ratios. And so what we do, in a crystal like that, which is a typical plagioclase phenocryst from Merapi, this is specifically from the 2010 eruption, which was a big eruption at the volcano in Indonesia. We have a plagioclase crystal, which is very strongly zoned, as you would expect in an arc rock. And so what we do to measure strontium isotopes is we do rasters along the zoning patterns to get as much signal as possible. And then those, every single of those rasters is then transported to the multi-collector mass spectrometer, and it's analyzed for strontium isotopes. And of course, we're going to combine these with elemental maps obtained with the quadruple mass spectrometer coupled with laser, and with electron microprobe work, which are the little white dots you see on the left-hand side. So typical transects for anorthite contents, which tell us about magma temperature, composition, water content. And not only we do strontium isotope analysis of the plagioclase, we also can analyze the matrix, which is that white raster at the top. And that allows us to see if the crystal or some parts of the crystal are in isotopic equilibrium with the melt that carries them to the surface. So in Merapi 2010 eruption, the contrasts in anorthite are massive. You can see that the anorthite concentration changes from about 40 to about 90. So that's a massive variation. And that had been linked to the assimilation of carbonates into the system. Based on this and based also on analysis of micro-drilled plagioclases. But what we found with this method, where we could analyze lots of plagioclases and really quickly and in a number of samples, is that we found no variation in strontium isotopes across the different zones of the crystals, and also with the matrix, which is the gray background line there. So we found no evidence for carbonate assimilation, and instead our data suggested that the different melts coming into the system were coming from the same source, but more mafic and antigassed magmas would lead to increases in anorthite content in our plagioclases. So it seems that this big explosive eruption was not necessarily induced by carbonate assimilation, but rather by injection of mafic antigassed magma into the system. This is something we did as an example of method development. And this was led by my former postdoc, Jack Mulder, who is now an ARC DECRA in Adelaide. And so what he did is he analyzed standards of different strontium concentration at different conditions on the laser to see how precise we could go. And you can see the y-axis here reflects relative precision. And so below the 100 ppm line, we are better than 4th decimal places, and we get down to 5 decimal places very easily if the strontium concentration in the plagioclase is high. And if the strontium concentration on the plagioclase is lower, we just need to use a bigger spot size or use rasters instead of spots so we can maximize our signal. But this is really fantastic because we can get not as precise data as with column chemistry, of course, but it's a very fast technique that allows us to get very high resolution data that goes down to the 5th decimal point, which is very good to assess variations in source and contamination. Of course, because this is so powerful, we want to also expand it to all the matrices, all the geological materials. But the problem of this type of analysis in situ versus column chemistry is that we get a lot of interferences, which you get rid of when you do column chemistry. So you can see on the left-hand side all the masses we measure for strontium isotopes from 82 to 88, and all the interferences we get from our samples and from our instruments. So lots of interference that we have to correct for. So what we did for that is we developed a data reduction scheme, which is based on iolite, and then the data reduction process is really fast and convenient. And one of the key interferences for this strontium system is the heavy rare earth elements, erbium and ytterbium. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a diagram normalized to chondrite. You can see plagioclase doesn't have much erbium or ytterbium, so we don't have a big problem with those when we analyze plagioclase. But you can see we can have problems with those in other matrices that are rich in heavy rare earths, like apatite, for example, which is the yellow line there at the top. And this is something that is important because apatite is a very interesting mineral because it's a super mineral. And that's something that is now being developed by Eugene Jegal, trying to expand this method to apatite. And because it's so interesting, because as plagioclase, it is stable in a range of magma compositions. It can be present in different generations, but also it is resistant to weathering, and it can be dated, and you can also measure halogens in it. So it's a super mineral, and if we can also get strontium isotopes in situ, that would be fantastic. So the problem with apatite, as we've just seen, is that the rare earth element concentrations are very high, but we can correct for those in our DRS in iolite. And our pilot data show very good promise. So we're still testing, but we can see in these plots are very similar to the ones I showed you before for plagioclase. The relative precision is very good. We can get to the 4th decimal place, and we are using spot sizes down to 50 microns in spots and rasters. But the problem with apatite is that it's a super mineral, but it's often very small. So this is an example. So this is one of those megacrysts. Remember the megacrysts of pyroxene I talked to you about at the beginning from Stromboli? Having lots of inclusions? Well, some of those inclusions are apatite. And so you can see the crystal trapped apatites as it grew from core to rim. And so you can see in this just one example that apatites are really quite small. And so what Eugene has done is she's mapped these apatites for trace elements, and now she wants to get as small as possible with the strontium isotope technique, so she can also analyze them for strontium isotopes reliably and precisely in situ, which would be really interesting in this particular case to get to know if the strontium isotope variations change as the host grew across different hosts, across different samples, to get to know more about the source of the magmas feeding this volcanism, and if there were any events of contamination or mixing between magmas of different sources. But also because we can bring this to exploration, because apatite is common in many deposits and often generates different generations in veins or in the matrix of the rock. So if we can analyze in situ, then we are able to assess what is the signature of this source or this hydrothermal event and how it links to the texture of the rock. And that's the beauty of microanalysis, that you can link chemical variations to textural variations. So for the last bit of this talk, I want to talk to you about how we are now starting a project on how we can apply all these methods to a range of main to accessory phases in plutonic and volcanic systems where we have a relationship to porphyry copper deposit mineralization. And so kind of trying to bring this holistic approach to get new insight on how these porphyry copper deposits form. So what we want to do is analyze pyroxenes and plagioclases for elemental variations, for strontium isotope variations, for major element variations, and also accessory phases like apatite or zircon in collaboration with colleagues from the ANU, where they are using machine learning algorithms to interrogate geochemical data from zircons further. And so the idea is that we can use accessory phases that are present in the tritral sands and use their chemistries to try to guide, first pass exploration. And then when we are in particular prospects, we can use the main rock forming minerals or the in situ accessory phases to try to vector for mineralization, particularly in areas where we have sedimentary cover or volcanics, or we don't have any clear supergene alteration in the area, areas that are blind to exploration, that hopefully these methods can help guide, then to follow up with geophysics, for example. So we want to develop the method in volcanics and plutonics that are mineralized and barren. And then we hopefully can apply it to some systems to explore. And one of the regions we are interested in is the Central Andes in Chile and Argentina. So you can see in the middle panel there, the red triangles are volcanoes, Holocene volcanoes, and they do this kind of like bend, interesting bend around the area where the black square is. Interestingly, that bend doesn't seem to correlate to the model depth of the slab below these volcanoes, which seems to go, doesn't show the bend at all. This bend is quite interesting because with my colleagues, Gideon Rosenbaum and our former student, now Dr. Jack Ward, it's interesting to see that these areas of anomalous subduction are often fertile or more fertile for mineralization. So this area is quite interesting, and so we want to investigate a number of things. The volcanoes, of course, to start with, but also that area has some large porphyry copper deposits and some river basins that drain those porphyry copper deposit areas that we can investigate the detrital accessory phases in. So I'm going to show you just a flavor of the results on the volcanics. So this is one of the samples that Daniela, my PhD student, is investigating at the moment, Daniela Parra Encalada. She's doing her PhD at UQ, and she has these beautiful samples with enormous plagioclase crystals, sometimes forming glomerocrysts, and also smaller plagioclases in the matrix. And from a volcanic point of view, they are becoming really interesting because the first thing she did is she analyzed the plagioclases for anorthite concentration with electron microprobe. And this is what she got as a result. So the curves, the kernel density estimates show distribution of anorthite content in her plagioclases. So you can see there's a big peak at anorthite 60 and a smaller peak at anorthite 30 or so. And so this is very interesting because if you look at what textures host those anorthite peaks, and that's on the legend, you realize that the peak that is formed by anorthite 60 are the microcrysts and the rims of the phenocryst. So the very final plagioclase compositions. So the very final things that form as the magma is erupting. And so that suggests that those magmas are, for some reason, most eruptible. And so to investigate that reason, we now thermodynamically modeling the conditions of crystallization. And those seem to be crystallizing at around 900 or 950 degrees. Now, she also finds that there are plagioclase compositions, particularly in the core of those crystals, that are much lower in anorthite. And those would form from more evolved magmas at around 800 or 850 degrees, much lower temperatures. And it's very interesting because in this area, in this region, there are also ignimbrite flare-ups where we get massive portions of the mush erupting. And if you look at the plagioclases from the ignimbrites, they have those kind of compositions. So it seems that those evolved cold magmas cannot normally erupt. They only come up to the surface as cargo with the eruptible compositions, and they're only able to come up to the surface fully when you have an ignimbrite flare-up. Now, in the central Andes, you have a massive crust. So the first idea is this crustal contamination? Well, to understand if it is, we need to look at the strontium isotopes that she has obtained on these same plagioclases. And they are all summarized here. So different colors represent different volcanoes. And what we see on the y-axis are strontium isotope ratios, and on the x-axis, distance from the rim of each of those crystals towards the core. And so you can see how many of the rims have a very similar low strontium isotope composition that is that kind of most eruptible melt. But as we move into the cores to the right, we get more radiogenic isotopic compositions. And that suggests indeed crustal contamination. So there is a lot of crustal contaminated magmas sitting in those complex crystal masses that do not come out unless we have an ignimbrite flare-up. And those are the compositions of the strontium isotope for the ignimbrite plagioclases, and they agree very well with our core compositions. So it all seems to be building a story of, you know, this heavily crustally contaminated material, cold masses sitting there on the crust, only being mobilized properly when you get an ignimbrite flare-up, when the crust is hot and is able to move things up. And in normal volcanism, they only become recycled by those most eruptible melts. Now, this is very interesting because now the next thing is to then compare this to the intrusives and see if we can see similar variations in intrusive rocks that are mineralized and barren, and see what we can tease out of all of this information, because this variations in strontium isotope ratios are larger than what you see at the bulk rock scale and the entire Central Andes. So we can actually resolve very complex histories that you would not be able to see at the bulk rock scale. So I hope I convinced you that deconstructing the mush is the way forward. No, what I wanted to explain is that with this microanalytical approach, we can really marry together chemical variations with textural variations, and that's really powerful to get to know more about how magmatic systems work, why they erupt, and why they accumulate critical metals. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Teresa.
Thank you.
Very good talk. A lot of analytical techniques applied. Super nice. I'll start with a question first, more on the rare earth and peralkaline intrusions. Sometimes when you look at those intrusions, there are a lot of different plugs in some areas. And sometimes when you look at the rare earth content, they are not evenly distributed.
Yeah.
So what's your thoughts about this heterogeneity? Like, is it something about more just how those plugs differentiate through time, or is it like some structure or maybe the raw or some crystal contamination associated?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So in the case of the Tungai case study, it's been very interesting to see how as you move from the non-mineralized intrusions to the mineralized intrusion, you get this progressive fractionation and alkaline enrichment, very progressive, that you can really track really well with the pyroxene data. So it does seem that you get magmas that are progressively evolving, becoming more alkaline, and probably accumulating more and more volatiles, which are incompatible. And only when you get to the very end of the story, where you are very evolved and very volatile rich and very peralkaline, and you go up and emplace that, that's when you get your deposit. And that's something you can track with the pyroxene composition, which is really cool.
Just follow up. And what would be your approach if you don't have the tools to analyze the pyroxene?
Well, that's a good question, because as you saw, the petrography already hinted this kind of progressive evolution that we saw with the chemistry. The petrography already hinted that when we are in the non-mineralized ones, we get diopside cores and the edgerine only shows up in the rims. And then as you move into Tungai, you get the very green crystals. So you see, with careful petrography, you can get a lot of information to start with.
Okay, perfect. Right. Tom.
Thanks very much. That was a fantastic talk. I wasn't quite ready to switch my brain on so hard so quickly this morning. It took me by surprise. Just looking at that sector zone plagioclase, pyroxene there, it looks like there's lots more inclusions that are rich in, it was
This is zirconium.
Rare earth in the enriched sector zone areas than there are in the other ones. Is it something to do with inclusions being excluded preferentially as the crystal's growing in different orientations that causes that sector zoning, or is it some other sort of kinetic?
Many of those inclusions, the ones that are yellow, are apatite.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that apatite seems to accumulate in certain zones of the crystal. That's a very good point. And we had some discussions about why that would be, and our conclusion is that, you know, you just get some magmas coming into the system that can saturate apatite, whereas others don't. Because the sector zoning does go through the entire crystal. In this particular case, not always, but in this particular case, it does go through, because even the core that looks like a core is actually also a sector, because in the sectors that are perpendicular to the C-axis, you also get differences if you're growing along the A or the B axis or in between. Thank you.
So if you go to the alkaline versus tholeiitic world and you've got two pyroxenes versus one, so you go to the extreme sort of fractionation in alkaline systems, and that's the best place, obviously, to find rare earth systems. So what is it about, so the concentration that went from the primary magma that decided to go into the tholeiitic or alkaline, how does that sort of history and the play out of the clinopyroxene fractionation actually end up being so enriched in the alkaline end versus the other one. And if you take the Dunedin volcano, what's bizarre is that supposedly the eudylite bearing rocks are actually in the early mantle breccia part of the system, like Kakanui mineral breccia, and then all the evolution to the trachytes is the very last bit, but they don't seem to have any evidence for eudylite. So I'm intrigued as to how this sort of history of evolution of the tholeiitic versus alkaline trend plays a part. No, that's a horribly big question, but yeah.
Yes, no, one of my collaborators studied the Dunedin volcano, and he investigated the pyroxenes specifically, and they look very similar to these pyroxenes. You have, you know, variably brown to green pyroxenes. None of them get really as peralkaline as what we find in Tungai, let's say, there. But in Tungai, you do have the eudalites there.
I've only seen one description of one eudylite.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. But the pyroxenes for sure are not as peralkaline as these ones. They do have green, but you don't get to like proper edging like here.
I have another question. When you go and analyze those sector zone minerals, do you usually, like on the pyroxene, on the plagioclase, you don't see any variance on the backscatter images?
For the sector zoning?
Yeah.
You do. Yeah.
You do?
Yeah. For the sector zoning in pyroxene, you see MBSE. For the zircon, you see it in CL, not in BSE.
All right. So I have more questions. So
yeah.
Is it best in the AC one to see the sector zone?
So you see it in all the planes, but you have to. It's easier if you see it in the AC or BC planes to identify it. If you look at it down the C-axis, it looks like concentric zoning, which can be quite confusing. So, but I guess you train your eye, but it's much easier if you have the C-axis because then you get the hourglass, and then it's very nice.
another question is, like, you measure lithium on the pyroxene, right? I think, and it's very low ppms. How good or reliable is the laser ablation to analyze lithium?
It's reasonably accurate. I know you like leaves. Here. Yeah, I mean, the accuracy for lithium is good with the ICP-MS. And, you know, we go down to a few ppm. I suppose, I don't know, one would have to compare what's more accurate, I guess, because LIPS is better for light masses and mass spectrometers are better for heavy masses.
Yeah, no, I think it's toxic.
Yeah, so actually, this map here on the right-hand side at the bottom was obtained by LA-ICP-MS. So this is a TOF mass spectrometer. And so the benefit of that is that we could get it analyzed really quickly. So it took less than an hour to obtain that segment, whereas the entire megacrust obtained with normal LA-ICP-MS took 13 hours. So we don't normally do maps that long. They normally take 1 hour. So this one was just special because it was pretty crystal. And it had a lot of information, as you can see. But yeah, in the TOF, we could get all the elements from sodium onwards in less than an hour, very, very fast. So that was fantastic. Yeah.
This is not my area, so maybe a naive question, but what was the significance of the strontium ratio? I think it was on like the second last slide, and you were looking at.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So when you look at elemental variations, you see you can track different melts into the system, but you don't know if this one, I think you mentioned. You don't know if they are coming from the same mantle source or not, and you don't know if the melts that you are looking at have some sort of contamination with other components, like the crust, for example, which is a big thing in the Andes where the crust is passive. So what we see here is in Merapi, we saw that there was no variation in strontium isotope ratios, So that meant that we had different melts because anorthite was varying, but the source was exactly the same. But here in the central Andes, the strontium isotope variation is massive. It's really distinct. The error bars here are within spots within the symbol size. So that suggests that we have very strong crustal contamination that we are able to resolve with this in situ method. Whereas if you do bulk rock, the bulk rock would sit somewhere in the middle because you are mixing the signals from the crystals and from the melt. The dashed lines you see there are the compositions that you obtain from the matrix of the rock. So they often agree with the rim because the rim of the crystal on the left has the same strontium isotope composition as the melt that carries the crystal to the surface because that rim grew from that melt. So the dashed lines agree with the rims on the left-hand side, whereas the cores are much higher in the isotopic ratio, which suggests that you have incorporated crust, which has higher strontium isotope signatures. Thanks for the question.
I have just comment more like you showing a little bit of the projects now going towards more apatite. And from my experience from all those accessory minerals, geochronology of zircon is always very reliable and very good. Trace elements in general is very monotonous. You don't see like a lot of big variance, but you see slightly variance. But I think apatite, titanite, and rutile, like they show much more variance of trace elements, but they also have good geochronological methods. So I think that type of like approach is going to start to refine a lot what we know from geochronological side, but also from the magmatic side and metamorphic evolution, because the trace elements are much more variable than zircon, so you can start to track a lot of processes, and also the isotopic, the temperature that it resets also gives a lot of information from cooling, from other things. So I think that's a very cool approach.
Yeah, and you can measure volatiles as well. It's a super mineral. Yeah, it's very exciting. So yeah, we're getting good pilot data, so hopefully we'll be able to continue.
Other questions?
Just a quick one, a bit offbeat, so you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. As a solid state physicist, I look at what you're doing, and it's really dirty physics. You've got lots of impurities. You give names to similar phases and so on, and it's very dynamic because, as you've explained as well. So time has passed. A lot of time has passed since the 70s and the 80s when the fundamentals of diffusion and impurities and material science type stuff has happened and so on. So now we're in 2024. Do people theoretically model this in terms of fundamental physics, in terms of the thermodynamics?
Yep.
Do people have multi-dimensional phase diagrams these days? As in not just the boring, and how much of that is applied to this?
So for example, in the previous slide, when I showed temperature estimates, that's done with thermodynamic modeling. Assessing what temperature these plagioclases are forming at is using thermodynamic packages that consider phase equilibria from experiments and thermodynamic models for individual phases. So it's very complex thermodynamics being applied to a natural system. And also when you look at the diffusion, I didn't talk in detail about that, but the fact that you see elements diffusing as they become faster diffusers can be modeled to retrieve timescales of magma storage. So you can know for how long that crystal stayed at a given temperature that you have also to estimate before eruption. And that's interesting in terms of knowing how much time you may have from arrival of new magma into a volcanic system until you get the eruption. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I just think thermodynamic, on a
question. Just does this all the zoning and trace element zoning, is that preserved through metamorphic events as well, or do you need relatively fresh magma? Like, is that, I know
Yeah. So in garnet,
are lower, but the
it's a great
time spans are longer.
Garnets, for example, make beautiful maps, and yeah, they are very much interrogated in the metamorphic in terms of metamorphic history and timescales via diffusion as well. Yeah.
Excellent. And plagioclase, apatite, monazite, all of these same deal?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so I think it's so. I'll ask you to thank Teresa again for the nice presentation today. And next week we have Daniel Carvalho from Glencore talking about resource modeling, its role in the mining industry, current practices, future developments. And hope to see you all there. Thank you, guys.